Director of Communications at Bond, and we're delighted to be working with Buzzercott, the long-standing partners at Bond. We're just starting a programme of work with Buzzercott, which this is the first webinar in a series. It's going to go on through the year. Hugh and I have worked together for quite some time now. And this particular one, we'll be looking at the issues of adapting financial governance in the context of COVID-19. There's been all sorts of stresses and strains put on organisations in terms of their governance and their reporting, and Hugh, Matthew and Eddie will be covering some of the main issues for that. The way we're going to run it is the session will be recorded, so you can pick it up afterwards, and the slides will be also sent to you after, so there's no need to write everything down. The way we'll run it will be to make the presentations, and then we'll have a sort of Q&A afterwards. If you're asking a question, don't put it in the chat box, put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and then we'll pick those questions up as we go. If there's any immediate clarifications that you want during the course of the presentations, then do flag that up in the chat box, and we'll make sure that anything that's not clearly understood is made clear. So yeah, delighted to be working with Buzzercott. Great to see Matthew, Hugh and Eddie, and I'm just going to hand over to Eddie, who's going to kick off for us. Thanks, Eddie. You need to unmute, Eddie.
Sorry, I think I double tapped.
There you are, you're fine, we can hear you.
Very much for pointing that out. The same thing happened on our seminar the other day, it must be me. I'm just going to talk about the broad general bits of governance. If we could go to the next slide, there's an overview. And again, yeah, so just to look at some of the guidance that's come from the Charities Commission. There's also some companies legislation on the way through which will make life easier in terms of the obvious logistical problems around holding maybe the kind of governance meetings we normally would be having, but also more generally board and other meetings on an operational level outside of that. Some of the implications for activities and funds, so what you can and can't do just at the moment. And particularly, I know a lot of you will have been negotiating with funders to get maybe some of the funding you've got repurposed or to work more flexibly, and there may be implications of that that need thinking through for a longer period than just during lockdown. Very quickly, just to look at the changes relating to serious incidents, or the clarifications relating to serious incidents that the Charities Commission put out, and then just a couple of broad overview, general practical sort of points. Hugh and Matt will look in a lot more detail at the real sort of nuts and bolts financial elements of the governance. So next slide, please. So just looking at meetings and compliance, the specific issues around formal governance meetings. A lot of organisations have specific timetables laid out for AGMs and things in their governing documents, or of course there are statutory deadlines for those companies and other charities that don't that still have a formal requirement to hold an annual general meeting, for example. The Charities Commission guidance that came out quite early in lockdown is pretty practical on this. It says that you should look at the provisions. You should consider whether you need to override those provisions. From the Charities Commission's point of view, what they've said is that as long as trustees document the reasons why maybe you've held meetings remotely or voted electronically, which isn't the way your governing document maybe says you should, that they would find that acceptable. For companies, there is legislation that's still going through, but will be backdated to 26th of March, which will enable organisations in very broad terms to do things like meet remotely, whatever the governing document says. So those things around checking constitutions, I mean, you do need to check what the rules of your organisation are, but again, as I've said, the Charity Commission say as long as you document why you didn't do what the constitution says, that would be okay. In terms of how you hold meetings, I'm sure we've all experienced lots of these Zoom and Teams type meetings now. In some ways, they're a great enabler for more inclusivity. People can always be available. A lot of our clients are saying they've got record attendance at their board meetings and things these days because people haven't got an excuse not to be there. But they do provide challenges for chairing and things like that. So I think just on a practical level, making sure you've agreed the protocols for how people will be encouraged to participate properly in meetings will be important. And I think what most of us will find is on that inclusivity front, for boards, for a long time, people have said that it would be great if more meetings could be held with the facility for people to attend remotely, because it means more people are able to commit to boards, etc. This is all part of that sort of building back better feeling we're all getting, that maybe some of these things will stick going forwards. In terms of meetings, away from formal annual general meetings, etc., what we're seeing a lot of boards are doing is holding additional interim meetings between board meetings, specifically to see how COVID is panning out. I think particularly in international development, where a lot of countries are maybe behind the European experience in where they are in the pandemic, it's pretty important to keep a regular updated view of how your different countries are coping, how they're delivering, and what the challenges are locally. And as Matt will go through in a lot more detail, regularly reforecasting and looking as things maybe become more certain in some places or less in others, at how you think things are going to pan out. Next one, please. But as well as the sort of financial procedures of getting board meetings done and AGMs, etc., that there is clear impact for all of us on the actual activities we're undertaking. I think in terms of where trustees get involved, maybe at the governance level, that will probably be more around deciding whether or not to do certain things because they're appropriate for your charity or might affect the reputation. I think in terms of negotiating with funders around delivery schedules, KPIs, etc., that probably sits more on the management side, and probably being clear about who would take on those different roles at a time like this is quite important, because you won't have as much sort of regular face-to-face interaction. One of the things that Charity Commission were very clear about in their guidance is if a lot of charities are getting involved in efforts, whether they're here or overseas, to actually help with dealing with the impact of COVID-19. For many overseas development, particularly humanitarian type charities, it probably will fall squarely within objects, but it's something the Charity Commission have said you really need to check before you start doing things that are quite different from what you normally do. There are issues, and these probably really relate to the accounting side that Hugh will talk about to some extent, but there are issues around fund accounting and how you manage different pots of money if you're varying the delivery terms of your various contracts. That could affect funds that you've been holding for some time and are now going to use differently from the way you originally intended. It could involve decisions for trustees about whether to release money that they've previously designated for specific purposes. And it might involve thinking through what happens at the end of any period of relaxation in terms of what the time frame is for putting restrictions back onto funds that you've still got at the end of the control period. You might need to think about how you work with other organisations. A lot of our domestic charities have found that because the public sector is carrying on paying supply chain, they've got people who are being paid effectively by the state, but with nothing much to do, but they're joining in with other parts of local relief efforts. That might be the case in other countries where you operate too, and it may be that your people on the ground are able to help local authorities in different ways. It'll of course depend on what the local funding situation is and work with particular partners on the ground. If you're going to work with commercial partners, all the Charity Commission say in their guidance is that you need to be pretty clear about how you construct any relationships with them, which is situation normal really. And it may be, I know certainly lots of domestic charities are working alongside big companies. It may be that some of that's happening on the ground in countries too. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about serious incident reporting. One thing that was anticipated is that a lot more charities might get into financial difficulty at a time like this, and one of the things that you're expected to report to the charity regulators is any significant financial loss you may have. What the updated guidance on significant serious incident reporting has done is said that actually at a time like this, if you're incurring losses because of the situation around you, because of the pandemic and the control measures, that you don't necessarily need to report that. unless it's going to seriously impair the charity. Typically, or usually, those thresholds at the bottom of the slide are what you have to report against, but they've said to not necessarily take those two literally. So the core guidance for serious incident reporting is unchanged, but really what the regulators are saying is you don't need to report that times are difficult because of a situation that's affecting all of us. You only need to report situations where your beneficiaries are under increased risk or detriment. And as usual, it's a matter for the trustees to sign off on. So whilst management will decide whether something might be reportable, trustees sign off on whether it does get reported. And then my last slide, I think. So just a couple of other considerations before we move on to other matters. Obviously, for international organisations, we're all very focused on the rules as they apply in the UK. We're all very familiar with the frequent changes in the local lockdown requirements and how to cope with those. We appreciate, and we've got plenty of clients who are having to deal with multiple jurisdictions and the different things that might apply there. There is the usual difficulty of understanding what the legal requirements are, not just at a country level, but perhaps at a regional and local level as well. And as law is imposed in an emergency way, that might become even more difficult. We've also found with a number of our clients that operate internationally that whilst we were all gaily thinking with the UK accounting staff, everybody can access maybe the accounting programme remotely, so there won't be a problem with finishing the accounts and carrying out an audit. Then actually you send people home with a laptop and their home broadband isn't good enough to actually connect back into the office. So there are lots of practicalities in different locations where the reality might well be, as you all know, very different from the way it is in the UK. And the only other thing I wanted to mention as a sort of side issue is many of you have got trading subsidiaries that generate in a usual year plenty of income for the charity, but where those are based around shops and events, etc., they might not actually be generating any profit just at the moment, and indeed might be making losses, and that can create quite serious governance problems if it's not anticipated up front. There are lots of initiatives within bodies like the Institute of Chartered Accountants that are proposing ways to deal with this, and I think we'll see some practical suggestions about perhaps extending the gift aid period. But I think it's important just to recognise that if your trading subsidiary is making a loss, there may well be governance action required to regularise the situation and make decisions like whether the charity should continue to support a subsidiary if it's in financial difficulty. And that's all I really wanted to say about the broader governance points. I think we're moving on to Hugh to talk about accounts and financial year end.
Thank you, Eddie. Yes, I'm going to focus in now on more of the financial aspects of the governance, and particularly the year-end statutory financial statements that any UK charity would have to report. Obviously, COVID has hit the sector in a number of ways, but in particularly from the financial point of view, two of the key ways are obviously the financial sustainability, which to varying degrees has had an impact on charities. And the other side is the logistics of doing things, the ability to be able to carry out a year-end process and get it audited. So I'm going to look at some of the practicalities around that. And firstly, I'm just going to focus on the practicalities of the year-end, of actually producing a set of financial statements. So anyone that might have been involved in producing financial statements for an international organisation will know that even in a normal year, it can be quite a challenge. There's a lot of information to bring together and a lot to coordinate with overseas offices. So factoring COVID-19 into all of this is going to create extra challenge, and so it's important that we prepare for that. And so the first question amongst all of this is, are you going to be able to do it? Are you going to be able to deliver? And that depends on a number of factors, and I'll just share some of the key things that we've seen that have impacted that this year. Firstly, it's that access to, fundamentally it's the access to accounting information, the accounting data. Fortunately, much more of it's in the cloud these days, but there's often things that are held on local servers, especially when the connectivity is poor in particular locations. So have you got all the accounting data to prepare your year end? And is there paperwork that's held in particular other offices that you need in order to complete your year-end processes that isn't scanned and isn't currently something that you have access to. So that's a basic requirement. But then you've got the people side of it. Are the people available to carry out the year-end processes? So obviously in the UK, we've got furlough, are there key finance or other staff that are involved in the audit and the accounts process who are not available at the moment? So do you have the capacity within the team? Obviously, with an international audit, there are potentially lots of overseas locations that are feeding into it, which are in various degrees of lockdown, and they may have their own year-end processes, their own financial statements and audit arrangements. So it's coordinating all of that. There may be third parties that feed into the process. So whether that's partner organisations that need to report into you, or whether it's things like pensions and investments where you need data off specialists in order to factor into the financial statements. And ultimately, there may be more year-end adjustments this year in terms of making adjustments to income, to debtors, to look at costs that may arise that come out of COVID-19 and require extra work as part of the year-end process. So all of this needs a lot of thinking through, and ultimately it can create delays and it can create more work. Fortunately, at the moment, the regulators are providing filing extensions. So the Charity Commission and Companies House, both in a very fairly easy way, are providing a 3-month filing extension for financial statements. You will have to think about other factors such as funders and what they might need for financial statements, but the Companies House standard timing is 9 months, so that can be extended to 12 months in a relatively straightforward way. But ultimately, there's broader governance considerations around planning, particularly around timing of how you plan out your committees and how that feeds it into the audit process. So next slide, I'm going to look at that audit process and the practicalities of delivering an audit. So we're a firm of auditors. We're delivering lots of audits at the moment, and the good news is that lots can be done remotely in terms of audits. We've managed to complete many audits from start to finish completely in a remote way. And a lot of that can be done just as efficiently as normal, but there are areas where it's more complicated and there is a lot more sort of planning and thinking that needs to go into it. So I'll just highlight some of the key points in that. So if you're someone who's overseeing this kind of process, that you're aware of some of the things that need to be thought through. And again, it comes back to that sort of remote access to systems. Can the auditor see into the financial systems and get access to the right information and data, not just from the accounting system. There may be other systems of payroll, HR, fundraising that we need to see into. And then it's the supporting documentation. Ultimately, audits, a lot of it is around seeing that supporting information and documentation, and is that in electronic format. There's also the people side of it, the access to the finance team and potentially other people within the organisation. And this often needs a lot more thinking through, because whereas in a normal year when there's a visit to the offices as part of the audit, that all happens naturally. That communication, people availability and ability to deliver information on a timely basis needs to be thought through a lot more carefully. Some particular tricky areas that we've noted as part of the audit process, just highlight a few here. Completeness of income as part of an audit. One of the things we always focus on is whether all of the income that you get is being recorded in the financial statements, and often have to go back to start from the source documentation. So it's the sort of the till receipts or the donations letters or the legacy files. And if that's not all held in electronic format, it's a big exercise to try and scan and collate all of that so the auditor can look at it. So that's something that needs to be thought through. Physical checks, if you've got material stock in the financial statements or tangible fixed assets that needs to be physically verified, that can be a challenge. There are some workarounds, such as looking at things on FaceTime, etc. But definitely is one to think through. And there's ultimately a greater focus on post-balance sheet information, which is extra work for the audit in terms of looking at potential adjustments that may need to be made, assets that might be impaired, debtors that might not be recoverable, that kind of thing. Naturally, one of the biggest challenges for any international organisation is the process of audit at the local offices, and how that factors into the overall process. And this can be a challenge to make sure that all of those processes finish in the normal timetable or in the set timetable, as obviously lockdowns develop differently in different locations. But there may be ways to work around things. For example, there may be certain countries where you're used to having a full year-end audit process which feeds into the aggregated audit, but it may not be as material to the aggregated audit, so the head auditor can deal with slightly more focused financial information rather than the full thing. But that all needs to be carefully thought through and planned out before anything like that's undertaken. So it comes back to that planning of the approach, and ultimately things often do take a little longer, need careful planning and adapting, so that needs to be factored in. But what about the financial statements themselves? Looking at my next slide, for COVID-19 will have implications for what you include in your annual report and financial statements. And the Charity Sort Committee's even issued guidance on this and what to include in relation to COVID-19. It's advisory rather than mandatory, but it's all common sense at the end of the day, and it's hard to prepare a set of financial statements without this kind of approach. So if you're talking about your activities for the year, your future plans, the risks that the charity's facing, the finances, it's hard to talk about any of those things at the moment without talking about COVID-19. In the financial statements themselves, there's also the accounting policies. Often the going concern accounting policy needs to be updated to take account of COVID-19. If it was a December year end, you'll also have a post-balance sheet event to report on as well. But the biggest thing really in the financial statements that's being impacted by COVID-19 is the financial sustainability. Now, every set of financial statements is underpinned by this concept of going concern. So that's looking at, will the organisation continue in operation for the foreseeable future? To prepare the accounts on a going concern basis, at the time of approving the accounts, the trustees must consider whether the going concern basis is appropriate. And in order to do that, they need to consider a period of not less than 1 year from the date of approval of the financial statements. And to do that, they need financial information. So they need the cash flows, the forecasts, the budgets, understanding of the uncertainties and the sensitivities within those. And ultimately, having assessed all that, you could be in a whole range of positions. Hopefully, you're in a position where you can conclude that you're financially viable, and that all you would need to do is to disclose in the financial review that you've taken account of COVID-19, but come to the conclusion that there's no impact on the financial sustainability, and you can prepare on a going concern basis. But most likely there's an impact of COVID-19 which really needs to be reported on to give a fair and balanced view. So impact on the fundraising and the income sources of the charity. So that needs to be included. But you could get into a position where things become a lot more uncertain, and ultimately COVID-19 has created a lot of uncertainty when looking into the future finances. So we have this concept of a material uncertainty within the financial statements for the going concern assumption. So what's that about? That's if you're in a situation where ultimately you're looking forward at the finances and you're starting to sort of make statements like, well, we should be okay as long as lockdown only, or the social distancing only continues for another 4 months, or so long as that income stream or continues to come in, we'll be okay, but otherwise. And so if you're in a situation where there are valid scenarios where you will have to stop continuing in operation, then you may have a material uncertainty. I think what it comes down to is if, say, you got into a situation, unfortunately, where in the next 12 months things did go against you and the charity had to shut down, could someone come back to you and say, look, you really shouldn't you have known this was on the cards at the time of approving the accounts, and shouldn't you have notified the reader of the accounts of that? So it's a judgment item, but it's a matter of being transparent and clear and having the right information at the time of approving the accounts. And that's really the key here. To make these kind of judgments, you need good financial information. So that really leads on to handing over to Matt and what he's going to talk about financial projections.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hugh.
Thanks, Mike, for also allowing me the opportunity to speak. So I head up the corporate finance team at Buzzicott, and one of our team's specialisms is supporting businesses and organisations on their budgeting and forecasting. And sadly, over the last 3 months, forecasting has come to the fore, and for many organisations, for exactly the reasons that Q has set out, that there is uncertainty out there. And therefore being on top of your numbers as such, and knowing where you're going for day-to-day trading as well as the governance are very important things. So I just want to run through some of the background to some forecasting and some of the key lessons that I would encourage you either as a trustee to be looking out from your finance team, or as a finance team in preparing anything. I think the first point to make is making sure whatever is being prepared is fit for purpose. Is it just for governance, or is it for the day-to-day? The majority of forecasts that we see do tend to be prepared in Excel, and again, the usual advice is often simpler is better than more complex. So people can understand and can navigate their way around what is being prepared, but just make sure you're thinking about exactly why you're preparing that forecast. And as Hugh touched on, right now we're seeing that the demand tends to be for going concern purposes, to make sure to understand how the effects and changes in assumptions are going to affect the business. In preparing any forecast, it's really important that you understand where you are now. And that comes back to some of the other more boring bits about making sure that all the other financial systems are up to date. And one of the most challenging things that we find in forecasts is the leap from the actual to the forecast. And often the biggest gaps come in that 1 month where one is changing, and therefore it's really focusing on those times and really understanding, just taking the time to understand where you are. One of the other common areas that that we see is charities, so not necessarily confused, but just the not being clear about what are ring-fence funds, and ultimately is one of the outputs from the forecasting is looking what headroom there is, what exists, what funds are available to sustain the charity. So you can say, yes, we can continue for 12 months, or alternatively, it's not good, but it's just being clear and pulling those out and being confident in the separation of those items. And the final thing about overall forecasting, and it's a very difficult one to answer right now, is the frequency of it. And worked with many organisations historically might have done a forecast once a year, and revisited that forecast maybe quarterly to reconfirm that the forecast they set at the beginning of the year, or that looking forward 12 months, is still valid. And then the cycle comes round and one redoes the forecast, which might be in a normal world sort of brought forward, carried forward with a few changes here and there. And so not necessarily, because it probably wasn't needed, a whole load of thought going into it. Now, for many organisations, it's changing on a weekly basis. The funding that you thought you might have had, might stop. The donations you thought you might have had might stop. Equally, things change, and money's come in from unexpected sources. And so the advice is taking a step back and just thinking about that frequency, because it becomes, you can get stuck in an iterative nightmare of reforecasting every 3 days, and you don't really want to be doing that, because you'll just lose track, you lose control. But it's about getting into sort of a rhythm, and ideally looking at it monthly, but it might be just rethinking at the end of every week, has anything materially changed, to put that in the process to change at the end of the month. And but it's keeping it live, and again, if you, I'm sure all of you have thought about your forecast in great detail, but it's just making sure that you keep it live. And then on to my next slide, please. So what should be included in your forecast, and very much talking here with the sort of the governance in mind, both for the for the benefits of the financial team and the trustees, and also making sure that you've completed the exercise, so the auditors can be content that you've been through a thorough process, that also the auditors and any others can, whether it's refined or whatever, can look back to see what you did. And as with any organisation, cash is king, and I think it's really important in the forecast that it is, it's cash flow that you are looking at. Sometimes we see a sort of hybrid between sort of the statement of financial affairs and cash flows and the mix. But I think for the purposes of the forecast now and for going concern, it's focusing on the cash flows and the sustainability and the vision on the cash flows going forward. Secondly, advice, very clearly split your assumptions, and the advice here, and again, it's not rocket science or complex, but it's just making sure that one is tackling the two things, although there sometimes is interdependency, but separately on income and funding and costs. And so, on the income and funding, it's having ideally, whether it's one page in Excel, simply plotting out, and we strongly advise that it's done on a monthly basis, as opposed to just sort of 12 months all grouped together, but plotting out on a monthly basis the different income streams that the organisation has, and monitoring those, and then on this weekly or monthly update, sadly for many, it's shifting that income stream one step to the right, and seeing how it goes. If one is doing that formal year-end snapshot for the auditors, it is drawing the line and trying to be as precise and give as much extra information in that forecast that supports why you believe that the income is going to fall in there. And again, being open and identifying where there is a risk that it might not fall. And each organisation will sort of create its own sort of sensitivity around when do you put something in a forecast. Again, many organisations do a weighted sort of, there's a 20% chance this will land and a 50% chance this will land and a 75%, and so do an average weighted and put it in. It does depend, to be honest with you. Often I end up more in it's either going to be there or it's not, and you've got to make a judgment as to when it's going to be there. Otherwise you end up with this possibly overinflated forecast of probabilities. But it's very much you're going to take each case as it comes. On the costs tend to be much more certain for most organisations. It's putting them in there. It's making sure that one has got adequate cost in there. And in the more complex forecast, there tends to be a correlation between cost and income. And sometimes, because you're going to get certain income, you're going to insert create certain costs. And again, without getting carried away within that forecast, linking them up. But again, it doesn't need masses and masses of Excel formulas and stuff like that. So just please do keep it simple. Having said that, and moving on to my next point, sensitivities. As this is now something that has become alive in your organisation that might have been slightly stagnant, being able to have the flexibility to be able to do sensitivities as you go along, and quickly to put in the COVID-19 changes, and touching what I said earlier about the changes from day to day and week to week, it needs to be flexible enough to cope with that. You don't really want to be doing manual processes, because in forecast, and one of the biggest problems with the forecast, whatever platform or tool you're using, sadly is the human who makes mistakes. And the more you can do to semi-automate it and put checks in, so when you are doing those sensitivities, the actual output is the answer that you're looking for. At the same time, on the sensitivities, it's trying to be practical about what sensitivities you're going to be running, and not having 25 different sensitivities, etc., because that will probably blur the outputs that you're looking for. It's looking at what are, as you touched on, what are the major things that could really affect the outcomes over the next 12 months. Contingency is another one. Sadly, in most cash flows, and especially now, things do tend to metaphorically cost more and take longer. And it might be that actually it's not necessarily costing more, but it's taking longer for the income or the funding to come back than one had hoped. Again, things over the last 3 months have changed so quickly. I've gone from having some organisations and clients who thought that the world was going to end, and it's like we're never going to get any more income ever again, and then actually things change and it starts flowing in much more quickly. And for some organisations, have been very lucky that it's been possibly better than it would have been. But it's having that contingency, and in all of these, and I haven't put the word on here, but the key word around forecasting is headroom, and making sure that you've clearly shown what you've got available to yourself, whether it's for this month or whether it's for 12 months, but pulling it out and clearly showing that headroom, and I think that probably takes me on to my very final point, just on summary. And I know it seems like a really obvious one, but please, when preparing your forecast, just have one page that pulls everything together, in an easy way, because it's amazing how quickly, when one looks back to this time period and you're presented with a forecast, whether it's a PDF or an Excel model, as to exactly what was this forecast, what was it trying to show us at the time, and the like. And therefore, a nice, really clear, concise summary is an absolutely invaluable tool, and it helps speed the communication around the organisation. And then if people want to go deeper, they can do. So I think that's all I wanted to contribute on that. Hopefully I've covered everything that Mike, Hugh, Eddie, you were hoping for.
That's great. Thank you all. And please do, if you've got any questions, do pop them in the Q&A box. I've got some. Thanks for all those contributions, Hugh, Matthew, and Eddie. Over the last few months, Bond's been doing a fair amount of research with its members, looking at the financial impacts on its members, and some of them are really quite drastic in terms of the amount of funding they've got and the likely long-term future that they have. So I've got some scenarios I'm just going to put to you about their situation. Just wondered if you could these are sort of real-life examples going on across the membership. So for example, at the moment, DFID is thinking about a fall in GNI, so the value of 0.7% in ODA and aid will fall. So it's prioritising, thinking of making cuts. One of the things that has happened is that programmes that were about to come on stream have been paused, and assumptions that organisations were making about what were almost cast iron guaranteed funding, very well sort of sources of funding with very good reputations like Aid Direct, Aid Match, they've been paused. People who had assumed, made financial forecasts on the basis that this funding would be coming through, are now having to sort of instantly backtrack with no warning, basically, because all these things have happened suddenly. How would you recommend an organisation handles that kind of sudden shock where a government just suddenly says it's not going to fund that stream anymore, and you've got all the plans in place, you've probably spent a lot of money developing the proposal, you've probably committed resources already on the assumption that the money was coming in. How would you recommend organisations handle that situation?
Shall I have a go? So I think that there are multiple strands to that one. First and foremost, I think going back to what Matt was talking about is really looking at whether it's existential. I mean, if the impact of that programme being withdrawn is so profound on the organisation that it would take away such a big contribution to central costs, for example, that the organisation was likely to become insolvent, then I think trustees have to act quite quickly to recognise that potential and to consider getting professional advice around that. That's the extreme level. And that is partly a matter of the process Matt was describing of looking at as things change? Does that blow our sensitivities? Does it take away all of our headroom? Or are there contingencies that we'd already thought about that we just need to trigger much sooner than we thought we might have to? So, I mean, I think in a time like this, most organisations will have contingency plans for how to downsize the organisation or lay more people off or whatever it might be. So that's the nuclear kind of end of it. If it's less than nuclear, then I really think, and part of the legislation that's going through at the moment is reforms to the Insolvency Act to temporarily suspend a lot of the provisions of the Insolvency Act around wrongful trading and put a moratorium on winding up petitions, that kind of thing. So I think you can assume you've got a bit more wiggle room to try and reshape the organisation, maybe take advantage of some of the government borrowing arrangements, those kind of things, to help you get through the worst of it and give you time to reshape. But I think the key thing is, in a situation like this, and I don't think I'm giving anything, I'm involved in governance for an organisation that's waiting on an outcome from DFID myself. So I think it's really just permanently at the moment, if you've got any unresolved funding that hasn't been fully put in place, is to make sure that you've got A, that kind of contingency plan in place, and B, that you're ready to meet at the drop of a hat to bring forward any actions you've agreed. If it's less than existential, though, I think you're into Matt's kind of scenario of what can you shuffle around to try and fill the gaps for now. Matt, would you add anything?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't just to reiterate, to be able to make all those decisions. It's about being ready. And I think in organisations sometimes there's a temptation to work on an annual basis and build up and get all the financial support ready for the end of the year. It's now about making sure that you are ready sort of tomorrow. So if you might have to make a decision, be ready now for that might. Not oh God, we've got to make a decision, then do the running around and then waste a week or 2 weeks to then make the decision, because sadly sometimes that's not long enough. And there are lots of other if one is closer to the nuclear option that Eddie inferred, there are still options available, and some of the stuff that and we're probably anticipating seeing over the coming months, and maybe more mergers of organisations, similar purposes and the like, where where the 2 + 2 does equal 5, and it might not be what everybody ideally would love to have done, but actually it still means that the focus of those organisations can continue and people can stay employed and the purposes can still be fulfilled. But it's about being ready to be able to do that and to communicate.
Yeah, I think it very much depends on the organisation and understanding the business model and the sort of headroom within the organisation, because there'll be some that are very much sort of institutionally funded, and if the funding is not there, the programme doesn't happen. They'll be presumably more used to gearing up or pulling back from programs depending on funder outcomes, but others that there's a blended model of core funding and funding from institutions to get particular parts of the program funded, where there may be decisions to be made around can you do some or all of the program from core funds in the short term, and so slightly more less black and white approach to how to respond to it. So I think that sort of initial sort of options appraisal is crucial. And then obviously if you are having to, you can't afford it ultimately, it's then looking at things like the overhead contribution that it's made and whether it actually has a knock-on impact, as Eddie says, onto the rest of the organisation.
Great. Just another finding from our research was that I think it was about 93% of bond members, we've got 450 members, so 93% of them are actually working on COVID response in country. I think it was a good percentage of those were doing that without having acquired any additional funds and actually using their reserves, which is all very well. But I just wonder if you could say a bit about, in a sort of crisis situation where you're what charities are like. They want to do good, they want to act, and they want to act quickly. How do you how do you balance that desire to do the thing that you do best with eating into your reserves? At what point does that become dangerous in terms of the sustainability of the organisation? What advice would you give to people around that?
It's an intriguing one, and the Charity Commission guidance I referred to actually does sort of touch on that very topic. And I think what I've heard in a couple of boards lately, including being on the other side of the fence, is just the comment that actually these are the situations that we build up reserves for. The purpose of carrying reserves is to be able to cope with extreme and unexpected situations. So on the one hand, the basic principle that you might use some of your reserves to work your way out of this is absolutely expected and normal. I think, like all of this, it's about measuring the risk that you'll actually endanger the whole organisation's viability, and therefore your ability to help beneficiaries forever, versus the benefit that you'll get from increasing its impact by using those reserves in the short term. And just to slightly elaborate on a point Matt made about cash being king, he also made the point about ring-fence funds at the same time. And unrestricted cash is king. But again, on a risk-based basis, and I'm not advocating robbing Peter to pay Paul, but on a risk-based basis, if you've got money in the bank and you're confident, based on a reasonable probability and known income in the future, that you can get the money back in the bank when you need it to deliver those funders' objectives, there's probably no reason you can't do a little bit, if it's all in a commingled bank account, of using the cash resources that perhaps are there for future programme work that is restricted. So I think that there are ways that you can manage your way through this, but all of that is based around very meticulous, documented analysis of the risks, and if you're banking on income coming in the future, it really needs to be pretty blooming certain.
And just to add to that, I mean, just anecdotally, what I've noticed is that often organisations that actually have less reserves have spent a lot more time thinking about the reserves policy and the minutiae of the different scenarios and the cash flows and everything else that we've been talking about. And so if you're someone with a more comfortable level of reserves that's looking at spending those reserves down, I think it's really about sort of challenging yourself that, have you got the processes in place where you really understand what is a safe reserves level to be going down to, and to manage that situation carefully so that it doesn't suddenly swing into a sort of more catastrophic situation.
Great. And I've got a very shy audience, but I've got one more question really, which is just the sort of it'd be good to get your thoughts on the way charities are constructed. I mean, I know this is a crisis situation, but do you think it exposes some structural? Or do you think there are some structural weaknesses which would need to be addressed in calmer times, in a way, in terms of the financial sustainability, the business models on which organisations are built? I mean, I think we're seeing the low level of reserves being an issue, but also the reliance on government funding, the reliance on a particular form of public fundraising. I mean, I think charities have been exposed on all sorts of fronts, and I just wondered what does that mean for sort of you have the kind of eagle's eye view of these organisations and how they're run. There's this moment of the crisis, but coming out of that, what would you say to organisations about how they think about the way they're composed and constructed and the way they operate? There's going to be some lessons, isn't there? Some casualties, I would suppose. Just be good to get your thoughts.
I mean, what it has highlighted in some respects is the sort of inherent fragility of the business model, if you like, for a lot of organisations, because ultimately, you are dependent on people giving in various forms, whether that's the public or the government, and things can change, and so has been in conversations where people have been discussing their reserves, and they say, well, they should be able to operate with this lower level of reserves, but how big a reserve do we need to have for unforeseen shocks? And this is a real example of an unforeseen shock, and how what extent do you plan for that? Because you can't just hoard endless money just in case, you know, something completely catastrophic happens. But it does highlight the potential weaknesses, and is making some people start to sort of rethink their reserves policies further into the future.
Yeah, I think just even further than that, I think, and particularly long-term development focused organisations rather than humanitarian relief, which is a very different scenario. And there's a big parallel with a lot of the public service delivery charities and social enterprises in the UK, where they're running huge businesses on an increasingly contract-like basis to deliver massive amounts of work that's open to competition from other sectors as well, on a basis that if there were ordinary businesses, is basically uncapitalised. And I think the problem is there is a real problem in the governance there, that the imperative a lot of trustees see, and I've sat in boards who've sort of said, you know, we've got an income of 89 million, but we don't want to have reserves of more than a couple of 100,000. That trustees still have a perception that, as Hugh says, hoarding money is somehow, well, it is inappropriate. It's raising money from the public, then not to spend on charitable activities is inappropriate on the one hand, but on the other hand, not having a properly structured balance sheet is inappropriate. And perhaps there's a role for social finance, I don't know, in putting some money that can sit and take the place of what share capital maybe in a company would do. That's one alternative that we've looked at. So in the domestic sectors where you're competing with public companies, that makes sense. And I think increasingly in development, there are all sorts of actors involved that are well capitalised businesses too. I think a circumstance like this, in terms of the income generation though, what it's really done is those organisations that have taken the most initiative and done what people said was the cleverest thing of diversifying their income and generating money more organically and commercially are the ones who suffer the most when things turn down, because the shops are shut and the events aren't running, etc., etc., etc. So I think in terms of looking at the diversity of the income streams, and maybe charities need to look at having that blended model he was talking about. If you've got a good mix of regular giving, commercial income and government money, you're much more likely to survive any particular adverse scenario than if you've put all your eggs in one of those three baskets.
Yeah, and I was going to add exactly, it is about sustainability and having multiple, like in any organisation, having multiple different sources of income, and you know, as we watch and see organisations grow, sometimes they start from one income stream, and they are very good at managing and building on that income stream or that funding, and it's taking it and it's expanding on it. And so when the shocks do happen, and you know, shocks happen all the time, and you know, they do happen all the time, whether it's something like this or whether it's you know, governmental change or whatever it is. You know, things happen, and being as wide and varied as you can be as an organisation, you know, does put you in a stronger place. Equally, you don't want to be sort of a metaphorical jack of all trades, you know, and having incomes, you know, that aren't, that aren't relevant to what you're doing, because you know, that can be a distraction in itself. But it's being clear about, you know, what you're trying to, and I think what this period of time will do is will make those managing organisation and trustees, you know, very conscious of the fragility that sits, which to be honest is only going to be a good thing in the long run, because it will make people, you know, double down and think, okay, if this happens again, you know, we'll be even more ready for it.
Yeah. Sorry, go on, Eddie.
I was just going to say one thing that it couldn't have been worse timed, yesterday's announcement, that if you're going to work as a long-term partner with public bodies doing something that isn't actually a commercial enterprise, a long-term partnership model where you're funded across a broad range of your activities is probably a great model, and it's even less likely to reappear after yesterday than it has been for a while.
Yeah, and I think one of the things our sort of financial surveys are showing is that whilst you know, many organisations, and particularly the sort of smaller, medium-sized ones, can sort of limp along through the next 6 to 9 months, I think the uncertainty about the kind of funding pipeline a year beyond that is the big challenge. And whilst we might not see organisations folding within this immediate period, I think there's a real challenge in the following financial year, April 21-22, it could be really difficult. We think, but yes, bit of crystal ball gazing. So I think what we'd like to do is get you back in maybe 6 months or so to talk about the same things and see where we are. Actually, I think that would be a good point of comparison. But I think we're going to close it there. And thanks to Hugh, Eddie, and Matthew, and thanks to Buzzicott for taking part in this webinar. As I say, it's the first in a series that we're doing with Buzzicott, and look forward to seeing you all. And thank you for taking part in the webinar today. So thanks very much. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for having us.